Inspired by his recent Jubilee debate versus 20 atheists, this video explores how Jordan Peterson, known for blending psychology, philosophy, and religion, reframes key Christian concepts through a psychological lens, even as his interpretations often diverge sharply from traditional doctrine. Let's start by looking into Peterson's background in Christianity. Peterson was raised in a nominally Christian environment, but didn't practice religion formally. Instead of attending seminary, his academic training focused on psychology and mythology. He was deeply influenced by thinkers like Carl Jung and Robert O. Laing. Over time, he began to describe Christian stories as true in an archetypal sense, rather than committing to their literal or doctrinal truth. In other words, for Peterson, these biblical narratives are less historical records and more symbolic stories about human nature. When Peterson reads Genesis, he sees the story of Adam and Eve not simply as a creation myth, but as a profound archetype illustrating the emergence of self-awareness. Original sin, in his view, isn't about inherited guilt. It's about the moment we become conscious of our capacity for harm. Similarly, he interprets Christ less as a divine being in theological terms and more as a psychological archetype, a model of voluntary suffering and moral responsibility. He often asks, "What does this story tell us about human nature?" rather than debating, "Did this literally happen?" Peterson's notion of God is also transformed. He frequently uses the term to refer to the logos, an archetypal ground of meaning, rather than the biblical word in John 1:1. He suggests that everyone operates according to a highest value, what he calls God, whether or not they believe in a traditional personal deity. By emphasizing this internal psychological dimension of belief, he downplays questions of historical or doctrinal accuracy in favor of exploring how these narratives function within the human mind. Next, we introduce a new term to capture what Peterson means when he speaks of God in this psychological sense: Anthrofundus. You might wonder why we need a new word at all. Peterson's use of familiar terms like God or the Greek logos can carry so much theological and philosophical baggage that it's easy to lose sight of his actual meaning. So we propose Anthrofundus, combining the Greek anthro, human, and the Latin fundus, foundation. This coinage signals a human-based framework of meaning rather than a cosmic or supernatural being. So what exactly is Anthrofundus? By this term, we mean the singular meta-foundational bedrock of being that operates solely within Homo sapiens on planet Earth, underpinning every human moral claim. It's a deep psychological structure, manifested in our myths, religious narratives, and cultural symbols that underwrites human purpose and gives life coherence in our earthly context. Whenever Peterson refers to God as the grounding force behind moral action, or something we cannot live without psychologically, think of Anthrofundus instead. This way, we avoid theological confusion and keep the focus on the human-specific psychological framework he describes. Now, why does Peterson choose to speak in religious language at all? To answer this, let's contrast his approach with Friedrich Nietzsche's alternative. Christian symbols, Cain and Abel, the cross, the image of God, are instantly familiar in Western societies. Peterson knows that when he invokes these stories, he taps into 2 millennia of shared cultural memory. For example, when he brings up Cain and Abel, he isn't lecturing on Semitic history. He's illustrating how envy and resentment arise at the dawn of human self-awareness. By framing it as a Jungian archetype rather than a historical event, Peterson makes it immediately relevant to a modern psychological conversation. Jungian psychology holds that archetypes circulate within the collective human psyche. By labeling these patterns with familiar names, Adam, Christ, Logos, Peterson avoids the need to invent an entirely new symbolic system. That said, his approach does share affinities with postmodern hermeneutics. He reinterprets old symbols through a narrative-driven, psychological lens, prioritizing meaning over empirical historicity. And even though Peterson himself criticizes postmodernism, his method can feel quite postmodern, since it emphasizes how stories function within the mind rather than verifying their literal truth. Let's pause here to consider what Nietzsche did differently. Friedrich Nietzsche, writing in the late 19th century, declared, "God is dead," signaling that Western culture's faith in a transcendent, absolute moral authority had collapsed. In Thus Spoke Zarathustra, Nietzsche created a fictional prophet, Zarathustra, as his literary mouthpiece. This move gave him complete artistic freedom. Zarathustra isn't borrowed from existing religious debate. He's Nietzsche's own invention, a prophet who descends from his mountain to proclaim new values, challenges the very institutions of Christian morality, and introduces concepts like the Übermensch and eternal recurrence. By crafting Zarathustra as a character unmoored from tradition, Nietzsche was able to build an entirely fresh symbolism for his critique of Christianity. Readers had to learn new terminology, terms like Übermensch, eternal recurrence, and slave morality. But once they entered Nietzsche's invented universe, his ideas stood on their own, without the weight of centuries of theological interpretation. In contrast, Peterson opts to excavate latent meanings within familiar Christian characters. He reframes them psychologically, which allows his audience to tap into that shared cultural reservoir without having to learn a wholly new mythos. The trade-off is clear. Nietzsche's approach demands more effort from readers. They must learn his invented language and interpret his novel contexts. But that also means his critique remains uncompromised by existing religious categories. Peterson, on the other hand, sacrifices some philosophical originality by working within the Christian lexicon, but he gains instant accessibility. His audience already knows the names and stories. They simply need to adjust their perspective to see them as psychological archetypes. Next, let's situate all these concepts within Peterson's broader intellectual trajectory, his personal faith journey, and the responses his ideas have provoked. Peterson's earliest major work, Maps of Meaning, 1999, laid the groundwork for his later books by treating myths and religious stories as maps of the human psyche. Under the supervision of Dennis Fox in cognitive neuroscience, Peterson synthesized Jungian ideas, drawing on scholars like Neumann and Jung himself, with evolutionary psychology. He proposed that religion encodes patterns essential for human survival and meaning-making. Fast forward to 2018's 12 Rules for Life, and you see a continuation of that perspective. Peterson applied biblical stories to everyday moral and psychological questions, illustrating how ancient narratives can still speak to modern anxieties. In interviews on podcasts like London Real and Joe Rogan, Peterson describes himself as someone who acts as if God exists, echoing Pascal's wager, while simultaneously expressing genuine uncertainty about metaphysical claims. His wife, Tammy, attended church regularly while their children were growing up. Peterson joined her more for practical reasons, baptisms, community events, only later acknowledging the psychological benefits he found in communal ritual. Of course, these ideas haven't gone unchallenged. From religious viewpoints, many theologians argue that Peterson omits central doctrines, like the divinity of Christ or the resurrection, and reduces Christianity to just another heroic myth. They contend that he's essentially a secular humanist hiding behind biblical language. From secular critics, others say that redefining God as an abstract metaphor for meaning makes the term too vague or inconsistent. They accuse him of equivocation, using God when convenient and Anthrofundus when inconvenient. Academic philosophers add their own critiques, claiming that while his psychological take is interesting, it fails to engage with deeper theological or metaphysical questions, turning rich doctrine into mere self-help anecdotes. Finally, let's touch on how Peterson's method relates to postmodern thought. Despite his strong critiques of postmodernism, his focus on stories being true in structure rather than true in history aligns with interpretive approaches that prioritize narrative meaning over empirical facts. In his lectures on Genesis, he'll often say something like, "This story isn't about historical events. It's about what's true in the structures of your own mind." That's a hallmark of postmodern hermeneutics, favoring the function of a text over its factual accuracy. In closing, Jordan Peterson presents a distinctive view at the intersection of psychological naturalism and religious tradition. By introducing a term like Anthrofundus, we can clearly distinguish between theological claims and the psychological structures he describes. Nietzsche, by contrast, invented his own prophet, Zarathustra, to critique Christian morality from the ground up. Understanding both approaches helps us see the trade-offs between leveraging familiar symbols and forging entirely new mythic frameworks. Whether you agree with Peterson or Nietzsche, appreciating these distinctions is crucial for any informed discussion of their work. If this video helped clarify Peterson's use of religious language and gave Nietzsche the service of a deeper dive, hit like and subscribe. And let us know in the comments, do you find Anthrofundus or Zarathustra more illuminating when talking about morality and meaning?